University as an Associate Dean, Learning, Teaching and Student Success. I'm joined today by my colleagues from the steering group from the Evaluation Collective, and what we'll be doing today is welcoming our guest John Blake from the Office for Students and posing a number of questions related to evaluation. Many of these questions which have been crowdsourced from our Evaluation Collective membership. So those of you that have registered for the event today will have been asked whether you wanted to pose a question. There were a number of key themes that we saw emerging across those, and some actually questions that we couldn't ask any better ourselves in the way that you'd worded them. And we'll be posing those to John as we go through this hour session. So there's no formal presentation. It's a chat. And I'm absolutely delighted that John could spend the time speaking to us today. So particularly reflecting on his role as Director of Fair Access and Participation at the Office for Students, with a focus on that kind of regulatory lens, but worth noting that we've got a lot of diversity in our Evaluation Collective membership. So we have higher education institutions. We also have organisations that work and support evaluation and APP within our membership. And we've also got a membership which extends beyond England as well. So there will be people on the call today from the other nations within the UK, really interested in what we're doing and what the Office for Students is doing in relation to regulation. So John, many thanks for joining us today. We will be asking you a series of questions. And hopefully we will be able to spend the time talking about things which are pertinent and useful to our audience. So did you want to do a brief introduction, and then I'll get started with the first question? So welcome.
Hello. I apologise. My internet is slightly... Lovely to be here. As colleagues may know, I've now been in this role is core to what I thought had to be central to what we were doing at the OFS, particularly in equality terms, because I had a very particular experience being regulated in the school sector, and where in the time I was there was a sort of revolution of approach where people were much keener to be discussing the underlying research base of the decisions that were being made about practice, but in a way that was had meaningful impact on what was actually going on in the classroom. And it seemed to me that we needed something that really embedded that. Clearly, there was a lot of enormously good evaluation work going on already, but it hasn't always had the impact that we would have wanted on the rest of the sector. So trying to bake that into the new APPs and to make that really the test of success of the new system. So that's what I've tried to do, and I'm enormously grateful for the work, support, and useful critique of lots of people here who've offered guidance, feedback, and responses, and I think useful challenges. And I think the core thing to say is that, to my mind, the biggest challenge we have at the OFS is this sort of hourglass relationship with the sector. So people come to us to say things and then want us to carry it outwards. And I think what I want to see is a process where we set a useful framework for discussions, as a regulator should do, but that those discussions are free flowing. So we are not the experts on evaluation. We do have experts that this group brings. Am I still breaking up? I am a bit, aren't I?
A little bit, John. Yes, a little bit.
Yes.
Switch my camera for a second to see if that gets any better.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
But I think the core of it is, and I'm happy to answer the questions you've got, but I think many of them, I'm not trying to fob people off by saying that I think some of these things are ones that go back to you and to your colleagues, but because we want to build a system in which the regulator is not the owner of decisions about what constitutes good evaluation, what constitutes good outcomes, that those are shared conversations across rich disciplinary boundaries. So I'll just stop there. Apologise. Tell you what, I might try and change onto my phone and see if that works better.
Okay. Do you want me to keep going with the questions, or do you want me to hang on a minute?
If you just hang on 1 second.
Yeah, we've still got people
Yeah.
coming in that I'm kind of letting in. We're up to 131 people, which is a fantastic number.
And your signal was much better without the camera on, although we now have a big JB on the middle of the screen.
Yeah, I mean, there's no such, you need to see a giant photo.
I can unspot. Yeah.
Is that better?
That does sound better.
better?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, there you go.
Okay, can we get John's image back up, Sam?
Yes, I'm just finding it.
Okay,
On my
I
screen.
apologise.
That's okay, John. No problem. No problem. So we'll carry on with the questions, and hopefully the phone signal holds out, because yeah, it's a tricky thing dealing with the internet when you're the only one billed to speak, John. But yeah, we'll plow on and see how we get on, and hope your phone battery lasts. But the first questions, a lot of the questions are obviously focused around evaluation in the APP. I really hear your challenge back to us about collaboration and about the conversations that we need to have back in our institutions. And this is what we will do as the Evaluation Collective and to take this forward. But the first question is from my colleague Julian. So I'm going to pass over to Julian to ask the first question of you. So Julian.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, John, and hi, everyone. My name is Julian Crockford. I am a research evaluator at Sheffield Hallam University for Applied Inspiration, and a member of the steering group for the Evaluation Collective. The first question actually, the first question segues neatly in from what your preparatory remarks, really, as if we'd planned it. So obviously you will have read and approved a significant number of access and participation plans recently. On that basis, what are your main reflections on the quality and scope of the evaluation plans within them?
So I think there is some excellent stuff in there that I both heartily agree with and really think will work and will be really delighted to see the outcomes of. There is other stuff on there that I am more skeptical about, but I've always thought it very important that this role not be a manifestation of my prejudices and preferences, but that it run with the strength of the evidence. So in both intervention and evaluation terms, there are things in APPs that I wouldn't personally do and may not think work, but they all had credible reasoning to our mind. And I think it is appropriate where people have set out a credible theory of change within a plausible understanding of the evidence, that they have the right and opportunity to undertake that work, even if I'm not persuaded it'll necessarily work. And if I'm wrong, that's great. I learned something. If I'm right, then it's great. We've all learned something, and then we'll build that evidence over time. Evaluation, I think, is the same, but sort of even at one stage removed, because I think there's still a much bigger conversation about what makes efficacious evaluation in higher education in practical terms. So it's very helpful having the clarity that RCTs can provide, but it's also worth noting, I mean, I was in the school system when EEF was set up, did a lot of RCTs, loads of the first set of RCTs at enormous expense, came back and said it really depends on how you implement this. And I will happily take millions of pounds. It depends on how you implement things, but it feels like that's not, and that's not doing down what RCTs can do. They are really powerful, but there is a difference in education from health. It doesn't really matter to the efficacy of paracetamol whether your doctor gives it to you on a red cushion or throws it at you from across the room. You might feel better about it one way or another, but ultimately it should take away your headache. But that isn't how educational interventions work. And I think what that means is that there are really legitimate cases for RCTs, and we should, where we can, do that, but that we don't fetishize that to the point where we don't recognize what other forms of evaluation and evidence can bring us, and we don't assume that everything will eventually be RCTable, because I'm not sure it is. I think part of the background that I bring to this that I think is useful is that my training was as a historian. I was a history teacher for years, and I think my view is that historians are much more comfortable with varying levels of evidence for things on the basis, because we work with so often there's no evidence for it. Did the Battle of Thermopylae happen? Well, probably. And you have to learn to work within a cone of validity for outcomes, and we're quite open about that. And I think sometimes the social sciences and even the hard sciences pretend to a level of certainty that that actually isn't really achievable. That doesn't mean we shouldn't strive for it. It doesn't mean there isn't an objective reality we're attempting to describe. I believe very strongly there is. There are answers, but we also have to be clear that we may not get as close as we want to those answers, and we have to operate with the evidence we have. This success of the APPs will we know more at the end than we do now? To bring back to the specific answer to your question, Julian, I think there's lots of very good stuff in the APs. I think there's some. I don't think there's anything dreadful in there, but I also think one of the tasks that I would set to this group is that you should go through those things and tell us whether you think that. I mean, hopefully in the same spirit I've said what I've said today. There's not just be like, oh my god, I can't believe the OFS approved this, because that's not massively helpful. But I think actually critique of this evaluation may not work as effectively as you want because A, B, and C. And I think, I'm sorry, I know this is a long answer, but I'll finish with just this final thought. When I first started this job, I said that I thought we needed much more independent evaluation of the efficacy of work, because partly for the credibility with policymakers, and partly because I'd seen a lot of kind of happy surveys coming out of again, I imagine nobody in this room's teams, but there was a fair amount there. And some colleagues sat me down and said, from across the sector, said, we think that's a mistake. We think it will be much more expensive than you think it's going to be, and we think there's a cheaper and easier way to do that, and that's just to use an open science model. And my view is that they were right, that we could get a lot further by simply saying, this is what we're trying to evaluate, this is how we're going to do it, and we're going to publish. And that's why my obsession with the APPs, of course I'm interested in the work that providers are doing to deliver equality, but as a regulator, my obsession is publish your evaluations, because that's the thing. Like, publish what you're going to do, why you thought it was going to work, and then publish whether it did work. And we will have some critique of that, but also we need everybody else to be doing that, because as I said, I want to get out of that hourglass system where we are the arbiters, the sole arbiters of whether a thing is good or not, because honestly, we just don't know that. We don't have that level of I think we can know that something's better than others. We would actually get to a point where the evaluation work guides what we will and won't approve in some APPs. We will get to a point where we will say, look, to be honest, you're trying something everybody else has tried, nobody's ever made it work. It's not really a compelling reason why this would be different this time. But I want that to be based on that evidence. So I think, yeah. So ultimately, the answer is, I think there's some great stuff in there. And I have a relative level of experience and understanding of this, but ultimately, you are better judges of that than I am. And I think we need to have that discussion and discourse going round in a spirit of collaborative improvement. But equally, people shouldn't be afraid to say, look, I just don't think that's, the OFS on evaluation, I don't think it's going to generate the outcomes I think it's going to generate. We're not going to snap our fingers and force that person to change, but we will learn better over time.
Well, thanks, John. Julian, did you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, just a very, as you were talking, a very quick thought that obviously the APPs are at the level of individual institutions. I'm just wondering if that's the best mechanism, or whether actually that kind of closes off the possibility of the collaboration we might need to answer some of the questions.
So one of the conversations I'm currently having quite intensively with colleagues in the DFE is my view that I'm incredibly proud of what we've done with the APPs recently. I'm also, and I should be clear, incredibly proud of what the sector has achieved over the last 20 years. And I do think it's important to remind people, we have an entirely comprehensively educated cabinet for the first time in British history. Most of the, and there's been a lot of focus on the fact that lots of those people went to Oxbridge and Russell Group, and the thing, that's the challenge we set 20 years ago. If you'd said to people 20 years ago, you end up with an entirely comprehensive educated cabinet, you'd all gone to Russell Group universities, people would be like, yeah, job done, bosh. I think we know now that it is more complicated than that, but we should be clear that the systems we've driven over the last 20 years have generated the sort of change we wanted to see. It doesn't mean the job is finished, doesn't mean the job is even the same, but we should be proud and pleased with what we've done. That said, I do think we are coming to the end of what can be achieved through incentivizing individual institutions to diversify their intakes, rather than beginning to focus on the scale of the problem. Doesn't mean we should step away from that. Clearly, we need to keep pressure on our most selective institutions to ensure they're doing the work, but we sort of know what that work is and how it needs to function. But to my mind, the really big challenges now are there are 50% of students going to higher education. We know there's a desire from 70% of the population to go. Where are those students? Why are they not going? Why do they not feel able to go? In many cases, they're not going to be what, the bright but poor of 30 years ago. They're going to be students who have quite legitimate reservations about going to higher education, either because they've had a really poor prior experience of education, or they don't think they can find what fits them, or they don't think they're going to get the support they need. And we need to make sure that we're not just counselling them that they won't face those problems, but making sure that they don't face those problems. So I think there is, and that is going to, that's a scale of problem far bigger than any individual institution. And that's why I talked about this at UUK last November. The work we want to build out of the UniConnect partnerships is around recognising that the APPs are very individually institutionally focused, but a collaborative element if we're going to change that problem. That said, I do think in the event the government can't find time and space to legislate on that, there is still more work we can do, not least because, like all crises, the current financial storm does at least, create a position where, the future of quite a lot of English higher education lies in the hands of the disadvantaged communities of England. Because where is there a population who can claim government money to go to higher education and currently aren't doing it? They are in the coastal towns, they're in rural towns, they're in left behind areas, and we are never going to go back to the level of international student supplement of our higher education system, and I'm not sure we even should want to, given the precariousness it's baked in. There is an opportunity here to say that focuses minds who may not always be thinking about the equity problem on those challenges. I think the APP provides a vehicle for those discussions, if not always for all aspects of those discussions. If we can align the legislation to do all of that better, so much the better. If we can't, then at least I think clear that collaboration should be baked in. And I think one of the things I've wanted to do with the APPs is to say collaborations are at least registered within the APPs, so that the biggest challenge to collaboration in the sector is fragile partnerships, which are charisma driven rather than deeply embedded in what people are doing. And it's not a huge hurdle to jump to write to the OFS saying, well, we're no longer engaged in this collaboration, but at least it's in the APP. They have to do that. We have to have that conversation, and it's enough to say, look, think about that before you do that.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Thank you, Julian. We're going to move on to our second question, which is around resources and capacity within individual institutions. And this is one that was particularly posed by our evaluation collective members. So Nathaniel, over to you.
Hi, John. So Nathaniel Pickering, Associate Director of Evaluation at the University of Greenwich. So as Liz said, this is kind of a resource question. The raised expectations around the APP evaluation has had a positive impact on HEIs, but there is a human resource capacity issue. How do we manage the tension between what we have committed to do and what we actually have the ability to do? And this is not necessarily a funding issue, but more kind of about the ability to recruit or build capacity within our people that we already have. That they have the necessary skills and knowledge to work at the level required and generate that evidence, we need to.
And again, this is one where I'm not trying to cop out, but I think this is one of the things we need. I want us to be able to push back and want to empower you to be able to take up with your senior leaders in your institution, say you need to invest for the growth of these functions, because this is not going to go away. I so long as I'm here, I'm putting a huge amount to evaluation, because I think it's the right thing to do, and because I think it really meaningfully is the only way to effectively regulate this area of our sector, because we aren't going to get, what I saw in the school system was that metrics can take you a long way, but they can't get you the whole way, because you end up building perverse incentives to pursue particular answers. And we did see that in some institutions under the last APP set, where people were either trying to answer the wrong question, from having a long conversation with a provider who'd spent a lot of time trying to work out how to close their black-white attainment gap, and then suddenly realised that what they actually had was an A-level BTEC attainment gap. Other providers who were trying to meet, you know, lots of perverse incentives. You're all familiar with what they are. So evaluation, I think, has to be at the core of a balance between being interested in the impacts and output and the changes that have come about in terms of the opportunities for disadvantaged and historically excluded students. But we also have to be interested in the way in which those things are achieved. Greatest mistake I think Ofsted ever made in the school system was they decided not to inspect schools that had above 1 in progress 8. For those of you not familiar, basically the measure of how well students were doing in schools. In my view, that was crazy, because either those schools were doing something everybody should be doing, or they were doing something nobody should be doing. And again, I don't say that to throw shade on people. I too have been in a system where the regulatory incentives forced you every year to confront the question of how far you were going to shade to the rubric or not. And I get that. So for me, evaluation is absolutely central in building a system where we can't eliminate all perverse incentives. And certainly we will never get to a point where there is perfect information between the regulator and the regulatees, because there are loads of other incentives in that. But evaluation brings us closer, I think, than anything else to an honest accounting of what's going on, why it's happening, and what it can tell us. So evaluation is not going to disappear. And I think, you know, certainly so long as I'm here, I think so long as anyone's here, because I think in practical terms, it must be the next stage of public sector reform, engagement, management, and improvement, because I just think it has to be. So it is in everyone's interest to be investing in that growth of human capacity, and how best they do that, I think, is better left to you than it is to me saying they must do X, Y, and Z. But I want you to feel that you can go to your senior leaders and say, you know, this isn't a joke. Like, we need to do this, and that needs to be, you know, we need that sense of ownership of the importance of evaluation to spread beyond just evaluation experts and practitioners, and to really build up again the space that I think emerged in schools towards the end of the time there, and is still there. It's not everywhere and it's not perfect, but that there was really a strong meeting place between researchers and practitioners, that meant that the value of the practitioners could see the value in the research, and researchers could see the impact. You know, and if I have a criticism of, and again, not I suspect of anyone in this room, but of the general sort of where educational studies went over the last 40 years, it seems to me it's become increasingly abstract, and, you know, to the point where I'm just doing work on curriculum change in the school classroom. It was difficult to find education researchers who were actively engaged with the actual practice of what was being taught in the classroom, because everyone was focusing on massive issues of in general. Not a legitimate question, not a student to ask about, but massively practical for day basis. And I think it's getting that circle. And again, I don't want my prejudice to drive that. I'm aware there are people who did some of that research that I may not agree with, but who were driving really useful practice. So I think how that meets and comes together, that's a very long way of saying there's no magical money coming to fund this, but except to say that this is, I would rather, and if the challenge is when people come back and say, look, the reason we can't do this evaluation that we promised is we haven't got the human capacity, I'd rather people said, and here is our plan for how we're going to build that human capacity so we can do that evaluation better next time, than said, here is the half-assed version of the evaluation we promised you because we didn't have the people to do it. It is the whole aim of this system is that we know more in the future than we do now, and I'm willing to accept sensible trade-offs for that. Well, I'm not willing to people come, you know, and yeah. So, but what I don't want is people come back and be like, "Oh, we just didn't have the people, and we didn't tell you, and we didn't think about it." It's like, no, that's not good enough. Like, these are regulatory commitments that have been entered into the APPs. I know this is a ferociously difficult time. I'm delighted I'm not a senior leader in a university right now. It must be a nightmare. But, them's the breaks. Those are the cards you've been dealt. I'm absolutely up for having serious conversations about what that means about those regulatory commitments. I am not up for just unilaterally saying, or for providing unilaterally saying, well, we just didn't bother, because that, and I have taken a risk in building a system that rests on evaluation rather than on hard, but I think misleading metrics. And I need the system to recognise that is, I think, a good approach, but it does require a level of responsibility in providers. And as I say, I'm open to people coming back and saying, look, this is what we're doing about it. We can't meet what we said, but this is what we're doing about it. And that seems perfectly sensible. What I'm not up for people coming back and say, well, we just didn't bother. And that's both true of the interventions, but also true of the evaluations.
Yeah, thanks, John. Did you have any follow-up, Nathaniel?
Yeah, I agree, John. I think there's a real responsibility as us as individuals within this space to kind of build that capacity. And I think, organisations like the Evaluation Collective are definitely doing some of that activity. I think for me, and you're right, that's up to us to have those conversations with our senior leaders as well. But in this very kind of complex environment which we work, I think there's real clarity of messages from the OFS that this is a priority, that and you wrote your APPs and they've all been submitted, that you actually have to think about that for over the next 5 years, and clarity around messaging from OFS is just really helpful there. There's kind of, these are still on the agenda, we're still driving that forward.
And I'm very happy to do that, although my sense genuinely is the best way of transmitting that moment is for you to walk into a room and say, this is what John said to me. I will get on the phone and talk to the VCs, because I do try to say these things in public stuff, but I don't, there's an awful lot of people in here for me to say entirely off the record things, but I think, as well as I do that our comms has not always been as good as it should be. And I still don't know that we are as certain of the reach of what we say as we need to be. My sense is that, but I am happy to pick up the phone to anyone that you want to say that message, but I'm not going to tell them you must do X. I will tell them this is what will happen if you don't. And if at the end of this, you don't meet those requirements and you don't have a decent explanation why, that is who I will go after. If you do, if you meet them or you have a decent explanation, I will go anywhere and talk to anyone and say that's what we asked them to do. And I really want to reiterate that. People out there are like, well, what if we do spend all this money and it doesn't work? If you do what you said in terms of evaluation, I will, your university council, your metro mayor, the cabinet, I will stand behind people to do that.
Lovely. Thank you, John. And I think that's music to our ears. And the fact, and you will get a lot of people saying John says. I can reassure you from this conversation that we're having today. So thank you for that.
It's the only thin sliver of power I feel I have. So
it's really nice to hear, and the people that are connected to the Evaluation Collective have that have that commitment to evaluation, and Nathaniel's right. Sometimes we those conversations are hard within our institution, so to hear it from you is really good and really supportive. Thank you. I'm going to move us on to a next question, and Sam's going to ask the next question and takes us on to types of evidence. So again, this is something which we're all, I think, grappling with within our institutions, and particularly specific types of institutions. So I'm going to pass that question over to Sam.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liz. So I wanted to ask a question about how realistic is it to expect HEIs to fund and implement RCT Type 3 evaluations in the current HE climate? This is a question that's being raised specifically by a number of our small and specialist providers, but it applies more broadly to all providers. All providers are experiencing considerable financial challenges, for example. So how realistic is it to expect HEIs to fund and implement random controlled trials in the current HE climate?
So I think part of it comes back to the point I made at the beginning. We shouldn't fetishize RCTs over and above all other things simply for the sake of it. And I think I saw Emma Thomas on here earlier from SEER, with whom I've had relentlessly pursued me on the question of what can small providers do within this space. And my argument is it's adding to knowledge, and I think there's part of there's what I think of sort of black swan work. This thing is supposed to work everywhere. Does it work in a small provider? If it doesn't, that tells us there's something wrong with the wider theory. There's also that thing about what can we learn in those small groups? What does that look like? And being clear that qualitative and quantitative research can be conducted in those, and and that might be collaborative, so that you've got wider, bigger ends. It might be purely qualitative, and we've got to be careful that we can't make too many causal conclusions from that. But again, we can know more than we did before. I mean, I think if I'm honest, I think the biggest problem that I see in lots of educational studies work is qualitative analysis that is given far too strong a causal basis, but I think things that begin that conversation are perfectly valid and useful. All of that said, I also am slightly skeptical of some institutions, very large institutions, saying, "Oh, we haven't possibly got the money to run RCTs." And I literally know what your education department gets given every year. Are you honestly telling me you haven't got? And again, I don't mean that facetiously. I don't want to get into the business. It isn't right as the regulator to get into the business of saying, no, you need to fund X, Y, and Z. But I do find some of I had a conversation. I won't name the institution, but one institution who I know has a lot of money, or just like, we just don't really know anything about, what will drive improvement in education. And be like, maybe you don't, but A, that feels like a very bold claim to say to your regulator when you're literally an educational institution, and B, feels like more of a you problem than a me problem. And I think I think there's a sort of thing. But I think there's both sides of that. So I think there's what's credible in terms of what can't be done, but also in valuing what can be done. And but as I say, I think I do think getting away also from paradigm wars is really important, and being clear that qual and quant have something to tell us. But, when I did my master's thesis, I had to write a whole section about why I thought doing mixed methodology was correct, and I just couldn't really remember, because obviously, I get that other people. I get it's more complicated than that before everyone starts saying an argument. But it's always seemed to, that's how we work as a regulator. We have some qual, we have some quant, we think about it, And again, I bring it back to my concept of, what counts as evidence for the historian is what you've got and drawing the best conclusions you can, rather than saying that there is a perfect point you'll eventually reach that gives you absolute certainty. We can know more tomorrow than we do today, and I think that's got to be the theme. I think the counterpoint to that, though, and I think this is the really hard bit, is working out when to walk away from interventions that you think ought to work, but you're just not getting the evidence. And again, we could go really hard on that in specific regulatory guidance, and maybe as the evidence gets stronger, we do. But I think part of it is just trying to build a culture where people can look in the mirror and say, do you know what, this just isn't doing what we want it to do, even though we really think it should do. And and I hope, in the sense of approving things that I personally wouldn't do, trying to lead by example of saying, look, the question here is, where does the evidence take us, not what would you like to be the case. And also being willing to say, that we've learned and changed. But I think that one of the biggest abiding drivers for me of the importance of this work, people talk a lot of time about value for money, and yes, of course, value for money is important, particularly in straitened economic times. And I spend a lot of time talking to people who've spoken to the Treasury, who all look sort of harrowed and broken by the conversation. So I get that that's a problem. But the people I really think about are often the very young, recently graduated staff who work in outreach teams, in providers, who are working for not very much money, and they're working all the hours God sends. They are brilliant, they are enthusiastic, and sometimes I look at them and think, I think you're wasting your time. And that is far more important to me in the end than the money. We have got an army of people. The problem we have in equity in the HE sector today is not the problem that we had when I left student unionism 20 years ago, where really trying to get people to understand there was an equity issue was pretty hard. Like, people get it, they want to do something about it, and we've got an army of people who are willing to put themselves on the line for it. Are we using them to the best advantage? Are we using that enthusiasm, motivation, and power to make the best difference we can? and are we sometimes having the hard conversation with them that kind of enthusiasm isn't always going to be enough? And I think it's getting that balance, but that seems to me a cultural matter rather than a direct regulatory matter.
Yeah, thanks, John. I really like the phrase, do we know more than we did before? I think that's a really good guiding kind of premise for us to keep to hand. There's a couple of comments of support in the chat around running RCTs and the support they've had from Tazo. Complex but possible is something that somebody said. Julian, you wanted to come back in, and then I'll move on to the next question.
Yeah, just an observation really that I think in your range on the OFS has become clearer about the distinction between evaluation for accountability, the kind of evidence production, and evaluation for learning and enhancement, which is kind of around knowledge production. But it doesn't quite feel as though we're there yet, that we probably need to,
No, and I think this is one of those challenges where, ideally those things would be perfectly aligned. We know they aren't always, but and in the end, I have to account. One of the reasons I was so interested in the credibility of what's generated by researchers, because I have to account for it, I have to defend it, but also one of the things I think a lot about is, why do we sustain an independent and autonomous HE sector in a constitutional democracy? And that's like a huge, like ponderous, like big chin stroky question. But I do think that when you see what's going on around the world, and the importance of occasionally reminding people that the fact that HE doesn't always give you the outputs you want is the whole bloody point of having an HE sector, because no one should have total control of the narrative and the critique of our systems. And I do think being able to defend the importance of that, and and I think what I'm trying to do is get that sense of doing that we can do that, both accountability and knowledge and learning, but but that some of it won't work, that some of it won't always be what we want, and that the space for that, I'm afraid, can't be infinite. It is publicly funded, lots of it. We are publicly accountable. There is a government that's going to ask questions, so it's not a and I think it's good to have a useful challenge, but it is also worth, and I will struggle, fight for this, is that space where it's just like, this cannot be purely transactional, money in, magical outcomes out. Like that's not how anything works. And if you behave as though it is, you'll always be disappointed rather than being able to celebrate the genuine learning that we've got.
Yeah, thank you, John. And a really a point that's really resonated in the chat, I think, from David, that talks about we're not shy of enthusiasm, but that point about whether we're running in the right direction with our enthusiasm is really resonated with people. So thank you for that. I'll move us on slightly to talk a little bit, and you've noted about collaboration and learning and how we share what we've learned. We've got a question from Helen now, who's going to ask a bit more about the publication and the plans that the OFS talked about recently. So Helen, if you're around and want to ask the question to John.
Brilliant. Thanks, Liz. So I'm Helen Sykes. I'm the head of Go Higher West Yorkshire. We're a partnership which brings together a diverse group of higher education providers in West Yorkshire. And our partnership supports member institutions with their access and participation plan activity. I'm also a relatively new member of the Evaluation Collective Steering Group. And my question is, does the Office for Students have any further updates on the development of the Higher Education Evidence Library by Tazo and Heat?
Yeah, so they are currently working for an initial launch in December, and there will be engagement with the sector over the next few months to seek feedback about, so to ensure that that library is fit for purpose, does what practitioners in this need it to do, whilst also delivering what I think we need it to do. The three broad objectives for it in my head are to act as a sort of, literally as a repository, so somewhere where in the final analysis people have got somewhere to put stuff. But that wouldn't be enough. I think it'd be useful to have people be able to go look at that. But I think one of the things we learn, again, from my experience in the school sector when we moved to the research piece, is that people are like, yes, every teacher will have time to go and search through all of the things on the EAF. It's like no teacher has the time to go and search through all the things on the EAF. So we also then want someone to be able to synthesize that, give us a sense of what the shape of the knowledge in the sector is, but also have somewhere that we've recorded those commitments to publication so that we know when they're coming through. But what I've said repeatedly to Tazo and to Heat is, that's my objective, that's my big tip. But I could sketch what I think it should look like now, but in the end, I'm not the one who, I don't have to use it for those things. I have to use it day-to-day basis. You've got to go and talk to people who are going to use it and work out how it works. And questions about exactly what needs to be on there, what doesn't. I think there's work to do, and that's work that needs to go out with the sector rather than just be hard answered by me.
Can I just ask I suppose a couple of follow-up questions around that? And it's about the level of control the OFS might have over it. And will the Office for Students be planning to monitor timescales for publication and manage sort of ethical approval for those external publications?
We are, to my mind, it's a place where when people said we're going to publish, people said, where do you mean publishing? I mean, my favorite one said, do you want us to publish in peer-reviewed journals? And I said, no, I'd like people to read it. Got some nodding there. It's good. That joke doesn't always go down as well as you'd think. But I mean, in all honesty, of course, it'd be amazing to have some of this go into peer review and to be part of that harder edge of the academic community. Obviously, we want to be feeding into that, but that isn't the primary aim of this. This is to give a space to do it. So we'll be monitoring when people have said we're going to publish. Are you publishing? And this is ideally they'll be referring it into their heel, and they might publish it on their own piece, but we've got places to do it. So just sort of maintaining that following. In terms of ethical, I think, again, an area where I sort of understand the shape of the problem, but I can't say that I have a deep and sophisticated understanding of where those challenges might or might not be. So I don't think it's useful for me to say, well, it must be X or it must be Y. I think one of the things I will say is that if it is useful to have the regulator issue clearer guidance on that question, I am willing to do that, but only if we think that it's likely. So we are going to seek at the end in the next year or so to work with the third sector and providers to generate some guidance on what makes good partnerships within access interventions. But the reason we're doing that isn't because I think we must do that, but because that's the feedback we've had from both providers and from the third sector, that guidance would be really useful for setting a good baseline and things like that. And that's very much the same principles operate here. I'm happy to do it, but I don't want us to intrude where we don't need to be. I think sometimes we can usefully set a framework, and that's what we'll do. But really to be driven by the sector need rather than by a particular outcome desire on my part. I think it would just come back to the point in the end. I want this information to be out there because I think it's important so people can learn from it, but also important because that's the form of accountability that's most going to affect it. In the end, we have a load of powers to start finding people if they don't start publishing their evaluations. And I think if we thought there was a strong enough reason to do that, we would do. But that feels to be ultimately counterproductive. The point here is this should be about wanting to contribute to and be seen to contribute to that knowledge and learning game.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, Helen. Joan, I can see you've got your hand up. I've just got one more question from the evaluation steering group for John, and then I'll come back to if we've got time at the end. Is that okay? Thanks for that, John. And I think some of the work around the publication parameters and timescales and ethics and so on. Again, it goes back to that point around collaboration. I think we've all got our own ideas about what that might look like, and maybe we can come together. Maybe it's something for the evaluation collective can source some of that information, and we might be able to work with the OFS on that. It's certainly something that we might want to consider. I've got one final question from the evaluation steering group. So I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Greg Brown, to ask that question, and then we'll see if we've got time for some from the audience as well. So Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, John. So yeah, my name's Greg Brown from the University of Glasgow. So obviously not under the regulatory purview of the OFS or pulling together an APP. But obviously we're engaging with all the same issues and challenges that you've discussed this morning in a kind of differently configured assurance and accountability landscape in Scotland. Sure, that's the case for other colleagues who are on the call from Wales and Northern Ireland as well. Very interested to kind of see how this work's been led in England in the work that you're doing. And obviously work still quite closely with colleagues through the Evaluation Collective and sort of in and around the updates on that. So Kind of with this in mind and wrapping up our questions, what upcoming challenges or developments should institutions be aware of and consider in relation to the monitoring and evaluation of their access and participation work?
So, I mean, it's incredibly obvious, but I think, you know, we are not waiting for a storm to come. The storm is here. We know that. I think I don't want to sound catastrophist because I'm not. You know, I believe the HE sector is resilient and will endure, and I think it will be. I do think it'll be different in 5 years, but I think it'll have more students in it and continue to be successful overall. But I think, you know, every generation of higher education policymakers has faced one or more of the issues of, are our institutions in the right place? Are the right people going? Are the right people supported? Are we delivering the right things for economic growth? Are we being funded appropriately? I think we are probably the first generation to face all of them at one moment in time and in a singly unalluring international scene, and with very limited economic fallback in the form of the state. Like, this is, you know, it's a maelstrom, and, you know, we have to work out how to steer through that in a sensible way. And that's why I don't think it's helpful to have me stand and be like, you must do what's in your APPs, come what may, come hell or high water, because I just don't believe people will do. And I don't think it's helpful setting people a challenge they can't achieve. I do think it's important to stress these are regulatory agreements that cannot be cast aside casually and easily. We're all going to have to keep talking about what that is. And we absolutely cannot lose sight of the fact that equity is a fundamental underpinning of the higher education system that we have built. And not just for, you know, woke reasons, but because that's what made it enormously successful. You know, I often think about, I mean, you talk about other countries and Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. I lead on our work interacting with those as well, so always conscious of interesting challenges and contrasts with that. But, you know, I went through a school system in which we were constantly obsessed with either Singapore or Finland. And things about Singapore and Finland is A, they're much smaller than we are, and B, they're much more homogenous. And as you know, I've particularly been to Finland, as Finland is diversifying socioeconomically and demographically, it is experiencing the same educational challenges that we experienced 40, 50 years ago. You know, they don't know how to deal with immigrant students who are coming in without really good literacy and numeracy, not because those students are inherently bad or wrong or there's something wrong, but because they just had a completely different experience of prior attainment that the system isn't set up for. Whatever is wrong with our system, and we know that there's a load of things we need to do about it, we have built a system that is remarkably open, incredibly tolerant, and given those starting points, incredibly successful. And we have to hold on to that and why we did that as we go through what comes next. Being clear that there is no point generating equity where the quality isn't what we want. So we've got to hold on to those things. But for me, the most important thing is that this is a dialogue and a discourse. Like, you know, and I don't mean that in a let's go for lots of postmodern. Well, you know what, I'm not going to go into my long rant about Bourdieu and my various thoughts about that. But, you know, I don't mean that in that let's, you know, but it is, I believe passionately in the power and importance of disciplines as the way of shaping what we do, because I think it recognises that nobody has a monopoly on truth. It doesn't mean there isn't truth at the end of it. So I don't think there's just random things, but that the route to that is through reasoned discourse and disagreement on the basis of the best possible evidence we can generate, and that we hold to that as we go through what's about to happen. Because if we can hold to that, whatever comes out the other side, we can build. If we have to build back, we'll do it. If we can build on stronger, we'll do it. If we retreat and lose sight of the successes we've achieved, or cling to fundamentally unrealistic conceptions of what we're doing, then I think we will find it much harder to get through that. So I think, and that's got to be through a matter of discussion. And part of the regulator's job is to speak up for interests that don't have institutional standing within providers. So sometimes we'll be saying things you don't want to hear, and that are inconvenient and difficult. But equally, it is your job to stand up and say, look, that you too don't have the monopoly on truth. You also need to think about these things. And I think having that discussion And I think if you look at the 4 nations, they are each composed very differently for how that discussion works. England chose a very particular way of doing that through regulation, which has, I think, led to an increase in, let's be honest, confrontation. Some of that I actually think has been really valuable for a system as complex and difficult as ours. And I think there have been necessary things where it's been our job to stand up and say, look, no, this just isn't where it needs to be. And some of the more collaborative system that you see in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland is because they're just much smaller systems. You can literally get all the leaders in a room. But equally, we shouldn't run away with the idea that this is a regulated sector where the regulator and its regulatees need to sit in active hostility, because that's just not going to fly either, because this is fundamentally a public service and we need to have that open, engaging dialogue. And we need to be able to draw on the expertise that lives in the system. And that's why I think things like the Evaluation Collective are so important, because I do think, one of the things I've learned most in this job is that humility is really important. Like, I think I'm quite good at some of the things I do. I think I know quite a lot about education policy, and I think I know a fair amount about evaluation, but I can't pretend for a moment I know as much as most people in this room. And even if I did, I'm not the one doing it day to day. That doesn't mean I'm going to accept what you say uncritically or without contextualizing it in things that I see, but it does mean that I have to be open to that voice, and I have to recognize that sometimes I'm wrong. And I think that plays both ways. And I think that, it sounds a bit cheesy, but it just comes back ultimately to the core purpose of what a university and a higher education place of study is. It's a place for learning through discourse. And I think that's what we have to hold on to, and that's what we have to model in the different ways that the different nations of the 4 systems have built it, and between those 4 nations in the discussion.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, Greg. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, and I know that Joan's been waiting patiently. So Joan, did you have a question for John that you wanted to pose now in the last couple of minutes?
Not a question, just a really, really quick comment. John, so fascinating everything that you were saying just there. Just the question from one of the colleagues about research ethics approval, I think. I don't think there'd be a role for the OFS there, because I'm assuming most providers here will have a research ethics committee, and any research that's being proposed will, chunter its way through that. And if colleagues don't, or if we're doing research at the SEER level, we can still use somebody else's research ethics committee. That was all I wanted to say.
Yeah, thanks, John.
To be clear, I mean, I'm not looking for an expanded role for us. I think what I'm saying is that where if people are encountering challenges like that, then it is absolutely up.
Absolutely, I totally. I knew you weren't. I just was. Yeah. Suggesting to colleagues.
Lovely, thank you, Joan. We're about 5 minutes to the hour, John, which is normally, I guess, time for people to get ready for their lunch. So I will kind of call our question and answer session with you to a close. Thank you so much for your time and battling with your kind of internet issues to talk to us today. A lot of the things that you've been saying will have resonated with the people on the call across the nations, but also those that have just been through that kind of evaluative thinking through their APPs, and we continue to work with that in our own institutions. And for recognising that the Evaluation Collective has a role in bringing some of those conversations together. So that's a really good point of reflection for us as a steering group, in order to be able to come together and think about the spaces that we could start to facilitate for the people that have joined us today and that might want to do so in the future. So thank you very much. I hope you have a lovely rest of the day, and we speak again, because this has been really, really insightful.
It's been lovely. Thank you ever so much. Thanks to all of you.
Brilliant.
See you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Cheers for your time. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Down to 24 people. I'll stop recording.
Thanks, Sam.